Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be talking about those final pointers for the VCE Latin exam. And for those of you who are new here, my name is Darren. I'm a third-year medical student studying at Monash University here in Melbourne, Australia. With today's structure, firstly, we'll have a talk about timings, then the unseen, then comprehension and poetry, the essay, and finally, just general advice. Firstly, timings. I've split this into reading time and writing time, but ultimately go with what you've practiced. Whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you've developed, I think that's the best approach you should go with for the exam. I'll just share my approach in case there is anything you want to glean from it. With reading time, I would spend the first 5 minutes just looking at the passages that they picked for comprehension, for poetry, for the essay, because you're kind of curious about what it is. And as I go through the exam paper, I'd also see the questions and read through them and the essay topics as well. I wouldn't try to intentionally solve any of those questions, but as you read them, you'll kind of have a gist of them. Are they hard? Are they not hard? And what kind of questions are they? And I would spend the last 10 minutes on the unseen. And here, I wouldn't necessarily be very perfectionist about every word I'm translating, but kind of just getting a gist of the unseen as a whole, what's kind of happening, what's the story, and also going into the translation part and looking at the overall structure of the sentences. So where are the main verbs? Where's the main phrase? And okay, this is an ablative absolute. These phrases sit within it. So kind of just developing my approach and being able to bracket off the unseen in my head. As with writing time, I spent 40 minutes on the unseen, 20 minutes on comp and poetry, and 60 minutes on the essay. I was pretty good with unseens. Comp and poetry, I saw it as kind of just to get through it. It's quite systematic because you see how many marks there are. The questions are very direct and you just answer the questions. The essay is an interesting one because though the essay is 20 marks, whereas say the unseen is 45 marks, I think to achieve a 20 or just really high marks on the essay, it requires a disproportionate amount of time. For some reason, that's just what I think of the exam. I just think that the essay, to score really highly, you need to spend a bit more time on it, which is why I allocated my time this way. And if you're curious, in my actual exam, I spent about 30 minutes on the unseen, which gave me a little bit more freedom with the rest of the exam. I didn't intentionally cut down on my unseen time, but if you've sat the 2020 unseen, I thought it was a bit more straightforward than some other unseens. Next, the unseen section. So I've broken this into if you score highly on unseens and if you find them difficult. So two different approaches. If you score highly on unseens and you kind of do well on them and you're usually able to get the entire unseen out, that's, for me, the main mistakes there would be small mistakes. So where I would kind of mess up this adjective with this noun, or maybe this verb and the noun actually aren't both plural, but I just assume they were and put them together. Those small mistakes, rather than like not being able to understand an entire sentence. So usually when I went through unseens, I tried to get it pretty right the first time through. So after each phrase or each sentence that I'm able to translate, I kind of look over it again and look at the endings of the words and think to myself, do those words agree? And did I translate them? Is my translation where I put this adjective and this noun together, do they actually agree in the Latin? So looking at my translation and seeing if it is loyal to the Latin grammar. So some examples would be looking at number, gender, case for the nouns, looking at the tense and person for the verbs, and then the subject, and see if they match the endings. The other thing I would do is that I tried to maintain an understanding of the story as I went along. I think this is a difficult thing to kind of do. It's not straightforward Latin translation, but it's more, you need to think a bit. And for me, this meant reading the context very carefully and really thinking about what's happening in the story, because you will be given the context and you just want to understand whether the lines you've translated actually make sense. Like if it was a story that they were telling someone, does it actually make sense? So this guy attacked this guy and then he retaliated and then someone intervened. Like, does the story actually progress well? And does it fit the overall context that you've been given? I think if you are able to manage the grammar well, so those kind of fine points, and if you also are pretty confident that your overall translation of the story is faithful to what's actually happening, then the unseen is going to be pretty good. And if you struggle through unseens, I would advise you to give it your best shot. And even if you see a really long sentence and you're just struggling with it and the sentence is like 3 lines long, I would advise you just look at the little phrases, look at little endings that go together, and then translate those phrases, because you will still be able to obtain some marks there. And also assess whether it's really worth spending time on the really difficult parts. Sometimes the lines can put your head into a bit of a muddle and it can really confuse you. So just be conscious of whether it may be better to spend some time on the comp, poetry, and the essay and just skip that line or give it your best shot. And then if you have time later, come back to the unseen. Because comp, poetry, essay is kind of English and it's also just knowledge-based. So sometimes it's better to get done with that and then come back to that really difficult line. Next, with comprehension and poetry, I have some general tips for both of these. So firstly, be very conscious of the mark allocation. It's a good guide of how much you should write. And sometimes it's 1 mark where you just need to identify. Sometimes it's 2 marks and it's identify and explain. It just gives you a really good indication of how much you should write per question. And for 1 to 2 marks, I would say a short 2 sentences. And if it's 4 to 5 marks, I don't think it's necessarily proportional to the 1 to 2 marks, but I would say like a small paragraph with some good evidence from the passage you're picking would be what I would be aiming for a 4 to 5 mark question. In general, I would opt to write a little bit more, and you'll see that as I show you some examples. And that also links to the second point where you want to be detailed. I think that if you are confident about information regarding a character or a scene, even if the question just asks, who is this? I would give a little bit of background info if I'm confident that it's right. I've just found with the examiner's report, sometimes they're looking for a little bit more, even though just from the question, it doesn't seem like it needs more. I'll give you some examples. So comprehension, this was from the 2021 exam. Explain the reference to Gorgone in line 13. So Gorgone is just gorgons, and it's 2 marks, which may indicate to you that you need a little bit more than what I said. And as you look at the sample answer, it says Pallas Athene had a gorgon on her armor, which is a bit interesting, right? Some people may just say Gorgone refers to gorgons, but you got to explain that Pallas Athene had a gorgon on her armor. And then you explain who the gorgons were. You don't just say it refers to gorgons. You need to say that gorgons were monsters that could turn humans into stone. And here for this answer, they've even said that the best known gorgon was Medusa. So some information that you may know, but you may think that, I don't need to write this for this question. But I would advise you to just be conscious of the mark allocation. And if you're pretty confident in your knowledge, then write down the extra information as well. As with poetry, I would advise you to have specific answers. The techniques, most people can identify the techniques: alliteration, assonance, synchesis, chiasmus. Most people know what they are and can identify them, especially because in the exam, it usually limits you to a couple lines. But I would really try and make my answers specific, especially when talking about the effect of those techniques. And one aspect of that is translating part of what I'm analyzing. I think that that helps the specificity of your answer, because everyone can write alliteration emphasizes. You can write that for any question. But in this particular question that you've been given, it may be the alliteration is emphasizing the beauty of the river or the inner strength of Aeneas. And I think adding that little part that's specific to your sentence is really good and is what the question is more so asking for. And also, like with comprehension, be detailed when explaining techniques. And I'll give you an example here. So this is from the 2022 exam, from the 2022 exam. And the question is, identify both the alliteration and the assonance in line 7. It's 2 marks, right? So you may think that I'm just going to write what the alliteration is, the words, and then the assonance, what the assonance is. Seems pretty logical. But if you look at the answers, yes, it wants you to write the words, but it also wants you to emphasize what is repeated. So you need to say the alliteration of S and F, or you underline those letters, and you need to say the assonance of the vowel A, which is interesting. It's just the way Latin is. You may think 1 mark alliteration assonance, but you actually need to give more detail. This is also seen in chiasmus and synchesis. Usually you need to write ABAB or ABBA, or ABBA for chiasmus, ABAB for synchesis, and sometimes explain why it's that. So maybe there are 2 nouns encircling 2 verbs. Finally, for the essay, I would advise you to spend time thinking of the structure of your essay and your contention and the moments you're using. I think thinking time is valuable for the essay. Don't feel like you have to rush, because I think that the essay isn't entirely an analysis per se. It's more you're trying to think of the moments that are related to the topic and then arranging those moments by body paragraphs in a logical way. So spend time thinking about the moments, thinking about how you're going to split your body paragraphs, and that way your essay is set up to be quite a fluent essay. Next, be wary of whether the topic is just looking at the given lines or book 6 or the entire Aeneid. I think the Latin essay is a bit interesting, question 17, 18, because they vary from year to year. It's not always just the lines and then the entire need. Sometimes it's the lines and then just the book you're studying. So just be conscious of that because it can change the moments that you can pick. Finally, be conscious of the mark distribution between question 17 and 18. Latin essays are a bit unique because the mark varies from year to year. Sometimes question 17 is 5 marks, question 18 is 15 marks. Sometimes it's a little more even. Question 17 is 8 and question 18 is 12 marks. This is important because it will dictate how much you write for each question. They're not 2 essays, rather they're 2 essays, but sometimes the marking is really skewed between the 2 questions. So if question 17 is worth 5 marks, however much you write, you kind of want to write 3 times as much as that for question 18. So don't be too perfectionist about, question 17 is an essay. I need to write as much as I can because you need to match that for question 18 to receive the higher marks in question 18. So just be aware of that and think of the marks when you're allocating how many pages and how much time you spend on each of those questions. General tips wise, I really enjoyed Latin, so have fun with the exam. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you guys for tuning in to today's video, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.